Chapter 1063, Lively Corpse. Sunny summoned the graceless dusk back and remained motionless for a while, looking at the dark expanse of the ocean. The sunrise in Antarctica was a long affair. By now, the sky was on the precipice of falling into a long period of twilight, but the cold waters still seemed black. After a month or two of dawn, it would be day for about 4 months, followed by a couple of months of dusk. There would be much fewer shadows around for close to half a year, which meant that Sunny was going to have a much harder time fighting. Many of his advantages would disappear, provided that the forces of humanity would even be able to last that long, of course. There was a good chance that they wouldn't, but there was also a good chance that they would. The situation in East Antarctica was much better than it had been in the Antarctic Center. In fact, it was more or less exactly what the government had hoped for. After the tumultuous first phase of the operation, all the population had been relocated to a number of siege capitals. The soldiers had hunkered down, and people were being slowly carried across the ocean to the other quadrants. That process would last until the end of the year at least. There were 3 field armies of the 1st Evacuation Army currently operating in East Antarctica, which was exactly 3 times more than the single one that had been sent to the Antarctic Center. There were also 2 saints there, one of the government's own and the emissary of the Great Clan Song. Once Saint Tyrus recovered from her wounds, there would be 3. The 2nd Army was on its way as well. They would be making landfall in just a few days, and once that happened, the human forces on the continent would be incredibly bolstered. The 2nd Army was supposed to be composed of twice as many mundane soldiers, awakened, and masters as the 1st Army had been. Close to 5,000 awakened had died in the Antarctic Center, but by the end of August, there would be 60,000 of them defending East Antarctica. Best of all, there was no winter beast to suppress all forms of long-range communications there, allowing the army to operate as the well-oiled machine it was supposed to be. That had to be enough to withstand the onslaught of the chain of nightmares for 5 more months. By then, most of the population would hopefully be evacuated, and if not, there was the winter solstice. With how rampantly the spell had been spreading in the southern quadrant, the number of awakened was bound to double, or even triple after the solstice. All the sleepers created by the chain of nightmares would receive the chance to come into their full power. So, although the forces arrayed against the evacuation effort would continue to grow more dire as time went on, the forces of humanity would swiftly increase, too. There was a chance. However, Sunny knew that there was one unpredictable part of the equation that could ruin everything. The great clans. Nephi's had told him that the southern campaign was a perfect battlefield for them to wage their war, and so there was a large possibility that Song and Valor would clash in East Antarctica, complicating the already dreadful situation. There was no sense or reason in their insane feud, at least none that Sunny and Neph could see. And yet, the threat posed by the war of great clans was very real. As Sunny looked at the ocean, his eyes glinted with cold, wrathful light. Those bastards! He had not even noticed when his hands turned into fists. Penny for your thoughts. Sunny turned slightly and looked at Jet. She had sat up and was now wiping the nightmare creature's blood off her face, looking slightly less corpsely, but only slightly. She was still a far cry from the fearsome soul reaper he knew. Sunny lingered for a moment, then said evenly, "Just thinking about the future." Jet studied him for a bit. "Really? Because you look like you're about to dive back into the water, this time to butcher a few abominations just for fun." She sighed, then said wistfully, "Why did you throw that one off the raft anyway? We didn't even retrieve the soul shards." Sunny scoffed. "What do we need soul shards for? You can't use them, and neither can I. That thing, meanwhile, was flooding the whole place with its rotten blood. We don't even have a rag to wipe it off." Indeed, soul shards were useless for both of them. Sunny needed shadow fragments, which could only be received by slaying enemies of equal or higher rank, while Soul Reaper could only replenish her essence and strengthen her core by killing living things. In the outside world, a single soul shard was worth a hefty sum of credits, but here on the raft, Sunny would have given 100 of them just for a mop. Well, maybe not 100. Sunny sighed, then returned to his chair and sat down. He was growing hungry, too. Jet stood up, shakily walked out of the puddle of blood, and lowered herself to the alloy surface of the raft. Her eyes had regained a hint of their usual iciness. She remained silent for a bit, then said hoarsely, "You've been in a dismal mood this whole time." Sunny looked at her with amusement. Not only was he amused by the fact that she had apparently had enough presence of mind to pay attention to his moods, with all that crawling around and trying to kill him, but the statement itself was more than a little redundant. How else was he supposed to feel after what had happened in Falcon Scott? Millions of people had died. The members of his cohort had died. And even before that, the first irregular company had been all but wiped out. Considering everything, Sunny thought that he had handled himself pretty well in the past week. He smiled darkly. "Yeah, and why do you think that is?" Jet sighed, then looked away. "Does it matter what I think? I understand, believe me, I do. In fact, I might just understand it better than you. But Sunny, do you want me to be honest?" He stared at her silently, then shrugged. "I guess." Usually, statements like this were followed by something unpleasant. She looked at the dark waves and shook her head. "I think that you have maybe forgotten who you are and where you came from. I am only saying it because I went through the same thing many years ago. When I left the outskirts, I was tempted to forget the truth of things, too. And I did, for a little while. But the world has a way of reminding you what it really is and what you should expect from it. Sunny, don't grow soft. You, of all people, should know better." Sunny looked at her, his face unmoving. After a few moments, he shook his head. "We are not in the outskirts anymore, and we are not the same people anymore." A pale grin slowly appeared on Soul Reaper's lips. "That is true, too." She lied down and stared at the sky, silent. After a while, though, Jet said, "Maybe you are right. Maybe people like us have to change, too. Inflexible things are the most brittle after all. But look around. With how things are going, the whole world just might end up like the outskirts soon. What are we supposed to do then?" Sunny laughed. "I'm the last person you should be asking for advice. What are we supposed to do? I have no idea. I don't even know what we are supposed to do tomorrow, let alone in the vague future. Let's just keep things simple. Today, we need to survive. Tomorrow, too. After that, we'll see. It would already be nice if we get the privilege of having a choice in the matter." Jet turned her head and looked at him seriously. Then, she said in a solemn tone, "I can't survive, though. I'm already dead." They stared at each other silently for a few moments, then both laughed. The raft continued to drift on the cold waves. From time to time, Saint would raise her bow and send a black arrow into the dark water. Every time she did, the spell would whisper into Sunny's ear, announcing a kill. Other times, he would have to dive into the ocean himself and help her deal with the attacking abominations. Shadow fragments slowly trickled into his soul. The next day, Sunny procured another nightmare creature for Jet to kill, and the day after that, one more. On the third day, her crow returned from its scouting trip much sooner than usual, announcing that it had seen land. Not long after that, they saw a dark line on the horizon. On the fourth day, the raft finally reached the inhospitable shore, and the two of them set foot on solid ground again. East Antarctica welcomed them with cold winds, dim twilight, and the familiar call of the whispering nightmare gates. East Antarctica was many times larger than the Antarctic Center, both in terms of territory and population. Its landscape was also much more varied, with vast plains, long mountain chains, and numerous lakes that ranged from relatively small to those that were as large as seas. Somewhere out there, in that cold expanse, 21 siege capitals were currently enduring the onslaught of nightmare creatures. Each of them was comparable to Falcon Scott in size, and there were close to 900 million people protected by their walls. Sonny was looking into the distance, feeling a bit uncomfortable. In front of him was a vast plain that stretched all the way to the horizon, covered in snow. It was littered by giant boulders that stood like solemn monuments to the ancient past, and cut by countless deep canyons. Here and there, hordes of abominations could be seen, flowing across the plain like dark rivers. After months spent in the mountainous Antarctic center, it was strange to be able to see that far. The world was broad and shrouded in dim twilight, looking quite surreal. Sonny felt exposed. What a bleak sight. It was still better than the poisoned wilderness of the other continents. He could freely breathe here, at least. There were also much fewer scars left by the destructive wars of the dark times here, although there were some. He could see the skeletal remains of massive war machines and the ruins of destroyed towns far in the distance, all covered with snow. With a sigh, Sonny turned around. Behind him was a slope leading to the ocean shore. Jet had just finished climbing the slope and stopped near him, breathing heavily. She still looked like a dead woman walking, but at least she was breathing again. That alone made her less unnerving. Soul Reaper remained silent for a few moments, then cursed quietly. There are still gates near us. Indeed, the call was still too strong for them to escape into the dream realm. She studied the plain before looking at him. Do you have a working communicator? Sonny shifted awkwardly, then gestured to the graceless dusk. This is a transcendent armor, you know. It has many wonderful enchantments. Sadly, one thing it doesn't have is pockets. I used to carry a few useful items inside a spatial storage memory, but those were all destroyed by the Heart of Darkness. So no, I don't have a communicator on me. Indeed, the covetous coffer was more or less empty now. Sonny had spent most of his supplies during the escape to Falcon Scott, and what little remained was then obliterated by the dark beetles. The only thing they had not been able to destroy were the spools of diamond thread from the ebony tower. Jet sighed. Pity, mine was frozen solid. We can't even contact Army Command then. Sonny watched the distant hordes of nightmare creatures for a while. Well, then we just have to keep moving deeper inland until we find a safe spot to use our anchors. Soul Reaper grimaced, which looked quite frightening considering her current state. She lingered for a few seconds, then shook her head. Moving inland, it won't be easy. This place is in a much better state than the Antarctic Center was, but that's just inside the siege capitals. Out here in the wilderness, the nightmare creatures still reign unopposed. You know better than anyone how hard it is to traverse an environment like this. Sonny smiled darkly. Luckily, we don't need to travel for 3,000 kilometers, and there are no civilians slowing us down. Hell, there's not even a murderous sea to flood the entire world every night. Come on, it's going to be like a picnic. He called, and a moment later, a Stygian black steed rose from the shadows. Nightmare snorted, ominous red flames burning in his eyes. The stallion's adamantine horns glinted dully in the bleak twilight of the early dawn. Sonny summoned the overpriced saddle and went about strapping it on the black courser. As he did, Jet looked at him with dead eyes. After a while, she suddenly said, "By the way, I never asked, but how the hell did you end up being mongrel? That doesn't make any sense." She paused and then shook her head. Actually, scratch that. In retrospect, it makes too much sense. We even met once when that gate manifested in NQSC. I feel embarrassed now. Sonny coughed. I just wanted to train peacefully in the dreamscape. Who knew people would make such a ruckus about me learning a few battle styles? This whole thing went out of control really fast. Believe it or not, I actually wanted to use the mongrel persona to stay under the radar. That plan, yeah, it failed spectacularly. Jet laughed, her voice sounding hoarse and disturbing. Stay under the radar. You call challenging Morgan of Valor staying under the radar. He winced. Well, I might have gotten a little greedy, once or twice, but hey, at least I got a very good bow out of it. It's still my best ranged memory. Those Valor Forgemasters really know what they're doing, huh? Soul Reaper shook her head. You're not too bad yourself, Sonny. I still can't believe that you can craft memories. Do you know how rare aspects that allow Awakened to create memories are? There are very few such awakened outside of Valor, and even those usually only work for the powerful legacy clans. Sonny remained silent for a few moments. By that point, there was nothing really preventing him from sharing his insights into sorcery with Jet. They had already learned a lot of each other's secrets, so one more wasn't going to make a difference. But it would be a long conversation. If he explained that his ability to create and modify memories had not come from his aspect, but rather from an attribute, he would have to explain what blood weave was, which in turn would require him to explain much more. He didn't feel like it. The knowledge would not help Soul Reaper, anyway, or anyone else for that matter. As far as Sonny knew, his ability to see and interact with Spellweave was unique. Instead, Sonny glanced at Jet and asked, "What's so special about that Morgan anyway? How strong is she?" Soul Reaper sighed. "Morgan, she is strong. No master is weak, but you need to understand that there are masters, and then there are masters, Sonny. Legacies are trained from childhood to be monstrous fighters, and that's just those from lesser clans. Those from the great clans, well, you can imagine. Morgan is not just any member of Clan Valor either. She is their princess. You should know by now who her father is." Sonny's face darkened. He finished dealing with the saddle and crossed his arms. "What about you, then? Are you stronger than Morgan?" Jet stared at him with her hollow, dead eyes. A corner of her mouth twitched upward. "Me, maybe, probably not. If we had to fight, I would most likely lose. Not because I am weaker, just because Morgan has the vast resources of Valor behind her. Memories, echoes, soul shards. You can't imagine how much power the great clans have hoarded over the decades. People like us don't have the same foundation. So I wouldn't want to fight one of their heirs, if there's an option not to. That goes for your friend Songsation as well." He scoffed. "It's a bit of a stretch to call us friends, and I think you are selling yourself short. I fought a couple of masters from Valor, you know. They're not that tough." Soul Reaper grinned. "Oh, really? How come you ended up stuck in the waking world for half a year, then?" Sonny stared at her for a moment. "Good point." With that, he jumped into the saddle, looked at Jet from above, and offered her a hand. "Come on, climb up." She hesitated, prompting Sonny to raise an eyebrow. What's wrong?" Jet cleared her throat. "What do you mean, what's wrong? I don't know how to ride a horse. Why would I know how to ride a horse? I've never ridden one. I've never even seen one before your Echo." Sonny blinked a couple of times, then suddenly laughed. That laugh surprised him, because he had not thought himself capable of laughing after Falcon Scott. "Gods, you don't need to ride anything. I'll control the horse, you just sit in front of me and don't fall off. I'm sure you can handle that much at least." Jet sighed, then grabbed his hand and jumped up. Nightmare exhaled loudly through his nostrils, confused as to why a corpse was sitting on top of him. Shadow God was also the god of death, though, so the shadow steed must have been accustomed to such things happening. Or not, in any case, he would have to deal with it. Jet looked down nervously. "Sonny, how fast is your horse exactly?" He smirked. "Pretty fast." With that, Sonny sent Nightmare forward. Soul Reaper would have yelped, but she was still having trouble breathing, so all she produced was a stifled hiss. The nightmarish steed carried a dead woman and a divine shadow as it raced across the snow-covered plain, moving deeper into the cold expanse of a doomed continent. Nightmare was flying across the twilight plain, ignoring all obstacles. He cut through the snow, maneuvered between giant boulders, crested hills, and jumped across deep canyons, his steel hooves sending sparks flying from the weathered stone. The dark destrier was swift like a shadow, moving with innate grace and incredible speed. Sunny was sitting in the saddle, holding Jet. She was basically in his embrace in the past. Being so close to her would have made his blood boil, but right now, he did not feel anything. Not just because Soul Reaper was cold and lifeless like a corpse, but also because his heart was just as cold and just as lifeless. He did not feel much of anything right now, except for deep, dark rancor. There was no time to, either. Sunny might have joked about how this journey would be akin to a picnic, but in truth, their situation was still dire. East Antarctica was teeming with nightmare creatures, and he was not conceited enough to think himself capable of slaughtering entire hordes of them. Sunny knew that he was strong, but he also knew the limitations of his strength. He had just been taught a bitter lesson on that topic by the winter beast, after all. Right now, his best friends were caution and speed. His shadows were scouting ahead, searching for nightmare creatures that lay in wait. Some he would avoid, some he would escape from by relying on how swift Nightmare was. Steering clear of the migrating hordes was not too hard, but the smaller swarms and solitary abominations were a challenge. Still, Sunny had not been forced to summon Saint yet, let alone enter battle himself. They traversed a good distance, then hid in a deep ravine, waiting for a large horde to move away. After the river of monsters was gone, Nightmare dashed forward once again. Rinse and repeat. Finding a safe spot to enter the dream realm was proving to be more difficult than he had thought. There were places where the pull of the call was not strong enough to disrupt their anchors, but all of them were crawling with the nightmare creatures. Slaying the abominations was not out of the question, but Sunny felt reluctant to create a lot of noise. Who knew what else would be attracted by the sounds of a battle? And so, further and further they went. Eventually, he had to admit that solving their problem was not going to be a fast affair. As such, Sunny had to change his tactics. He had not eaten in a long time and Jet was losing essence. They had to hunt. Sunny spent some time finding a swarm of nightmare creatures that was sufficiently small and isolated. After that, he commanded Saint to put an arrow into each abomination and slow them down with the burden of peace, enchantment of the black bow. Then Sunny set Soul Reaper on the beasts and watched from the shadows as she butchered them. Jet was still weak and low on essence. However, the creatures were merely awakened and weighed down by the soul arrows on top of that. He was there to interfere should something go wrong as well. Sunny was confident that his dead companion would be able to handle the swarm. And indeed she did. To conserve her essence, Jet shunned summoning any memories and attacked the abominations with her bare hands. However, as Sunny quickly found out, Soul Reaper was a terror to behold even while weakened and unarmed. When she struck the abominations, her hands simply passed through their flesh, directly shattering the soul cores. But more than that, Jet was already dead. Her body could still be damaged, and she would perish if it was entirely destroyed. But she was also not plagued by many of the weaknesses that most living beings shared. She could not bleed to death, but could ignore wounds that would cripple or kill any human. Jet was able to dismiss even the most severe internal injuries, continuing to fight without ever slowing down. Even if her lungs were crushed and her heart was pierced, she would simply continue to kill. Not even crushing Soul Reaper's skull would stop her. As long as she absorbed enough essence, her dead body would eventually heal, or rather, restore itself. Faced with such an unstoppable monster, even Sunny would feel a hint of dread. Good thing we're on the same side. In the end, it did not take long for Jet to slaughter the small swarm of awakened abominations. She killed them with her bare hands, regaining a little strength with each kill. Throughout all of this, Her face remained unnervingly calm, like that of someone focused on a boring chore. Then, a disturbing little smile appeared on it. Sonny was forced to remember his first conversation with teacher Julius. Back then, the old man had called Jet a murderous savage and a psychopathic killer. Sonny used to think that people were prejudiced against Jet because of her background, but now, knowing what he knew, he could see how strangers could have come to the conclusion that Soul Reaper enjoyed killing simply for the sake of killing. Very few people knew that she needed to constantly absorb essence to survive, after all. And who wouldn't be unsettled after witnessing something like this? When the last of the nightmare creatures fell to the ground, Jet straightened and closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling with satisfaction. She looked like a fiend that had just crawled from the depths of hell, awash in blood, body riddled with ghastly wounds, and eerily beautiful despite all that. Shaking his head, Sonny emerged from the shadows and went about dressing down some of the abominations to collect meat. At the same time, Saint started salvaging soul shards. Jet remained motionless for a while, then looked at him. There was some vitality now in her eyes. She smiled and said, "What are we doing now?" Sonny looked at her somberly. "Now go wash yourself. You might be dead, but I'm not. I can still smell things." Some time later, they were hidden in a small cave at the bottom of a deep canyon, sitting in front of a fire. A piece of monster meat was roasting on it, filling the cave with a delicious smell. Sonny was a bit sullen, because it had taken all his knowledge of wilderness survival to make the small fire, snowy reaches of Antarctica were not exactly the best place to search for fuel. He had almost been forced to use the divine flames of the cruel sight to cook, which would inevitably result in an atrociously burned dinner for him. Currently, Sonny was passing time by trying to play a simple melody on a flute made of emerald bone. Kai would have probably become ill if exposed to his musical talent, but Jet didn't seem to mind. She stared at the fire, flames reflecting in her icy blue eyes. After a while, she suddenly said, "I can smell things too, you know, when I am sufficiently full of essence. My aspect might only give me a semblance of life, but it's a faithful imitation." Sonny lowered the emerald flute and looked at her gloomily. "What I'm hearing is that you want to rob me of some of this meat, right?" Jet lingered for a moment, then grinned. "Right, that was exactly what I meant. I am hungry too." He sighed, then hung more meat above the fire. "Should have just said so. Gods, what is up with me always ending up with gluttonous women? It just never ends." Sonny turned the meat over. After a while, following a whim, he asked, "How did you end up with such a wicked flaw, anyway? I thought mine was bad, but if I survived the first nightmare only to be killed by the spell during the assessment, I would have been pretty upset." He really did not understand how it would work. Jet laid down, staring at the stone roof of the cave. She sighed, then shrugged slightly. "No, it wasn't during the assessment. Actually, I did not survive the first nightmare. I was young and weak and frightened, and so I died." Soul Reaper turned her head and looked at him across the fire. "But I didn't remain completely dead. I crawled out of the grave somehow and finished the trial. I guess the role I played in the nightmare, or maybe my innate attribute, created the possibility of something like that happening. It had to be an infinitely small possibility, though, because the spell seemed rather impressed with the result. Otherwise, it wouldn't have given me a supreme aspect." Sonny did not answer, considering what he heard. It made sense. He had also made something nearly impossible happen during the first nightmare. If he had not been sent into the body of a temple slave, Shadow God would not have responded to his unintentional call, and if he did not have the fated attribute, he would have never unwittingly climbed on that altar, most likely. Many things had come together to create the possibility. He had been the one to grasp it, though. Anyone else would have failed. Sonny looked at Jet silently, thinking about her flaw. What would happen if he gave her Weaver's mask? Would she come back to life? In his heart, he knew the answer. After learning about Weaver, the spell, and the vicissitudes of fate, Sunny developed an intuition about these things. Jet would indeed come back to life, but her soul would remain shattered. And like all living beings with broken souls, she would instantly die. This time forever. Her cruel flaw, mockingly, was the only thing that allowed her to exist. What about his own flaw? Sunny tried to imagine the life he would have had if not for the inability to lie. Would it have been easier? Would it have been harder? He would not have become enslaved, that was for sure. But he also would have never gotten close to other people, choosing to lie and manipulate them instead of trusting them, out of fear of being rejected and betrayed. And for that reason, he would have probably died a long time ago, or at least turned into something ugly and twisted. Was that the lesson he was supposed to learn? Weaver, you hypocrite, weren't you yourself the master of lies? Sunny shook his head and concentrated on not burning the meat. These philosophical questions were a waste of time. He would still choose to get rid of his flaw in an instant if he could. Jet sighed, breaking the silence. Actually, learning my flaw was not the hardest part. The hardest part was surviving the time between the nightmare and the solstice. As you can imagine, it's not easy for a sleeper to find things to kill before entering the dream realm. I ended up having to ask for help, and asking for help ended up costing me a lot. Sunny shifted slightly. Who did you ask? She chuckled. Who do you think? Just like you, I've been invited to the academy after becoming a sleeper. And just like you, I've been asked for the details of my aspect on a voluntary basis, of course. But what would an ignorant kid from the outskirts know? I told them everything, and from that moment they had a wonderful leash to keep me on. Jet remained silent for a few moments. That is fine, though. Even without it, I would have chosen the same. I'm happy with how things turned out, still. She grew quiet and then added wistfully. It would have been nice to have had more of a choice. Sunny did not speak for a while. Eventually he said, Yeah, it would have been nice. With that, he judged that the meat was ready and took it off the fire. Here, your dinner is ready. They concentrated on the food, content to be safe for the moment, with something tasty to eat. Sunny could vividly remember the times when eating anything, let alone actual meat, had been a cause for celebration. Jet could, too. Those times were gone, and no matter how complicated and hard their lives had become. Sitting in a damp cave located in the depths of a dying continent, Sunny stared at the fire and thought. I guess it's an improvement soon. Sunny and Jet continued their journey. The landscape of East Antarctica remained the same, and so did the dangers they faced. The two of them traveled across the desolate plain, sometimes avoiding the nightmare creatures, sometimes engaging in short and furious battles. Sunny felt a little bit numb and was glad to have a task to focus on. With all his attention concentrated on keeping them alive, he had no time for unnecessary thoughts, which suited him just fine. Jet, meanwhile, was slowly recovering her powers. The more abominations she killed, the less like a corpse she looked. At some point, she allowed herself to summon a few memories, and was now wearing a light suit of armor that was made of black, lusterless leather. Now that she wielded a weapon, her lethality had soared too. For Sunny, it was fascinating to watch Jet slowly come back to life. Her eyes were once again the familiar icy blue, her movements becoming as swift, murderous, and purposeful as they had been before. This was the fearsome soul reaper he knew. She might not have reached her peak condition yet, but she did not resemble a shambling corpse anymore either. Most interesting of all, her lifeless shadow had regained its vitality. By now, he would have never suspected that the person in front of him was not actually alive. A few days passed, and then a few more. 2 whole weeks had passed since the destruction of Falcon Scott. They had spent half of that time crossing the strait and half traversing the snowy plain. The plain was as inhospitable and vast as ever. Sunny made Nightmare stop, waiting for his shadows to assess the size of a distant horde of nightmare creatures. These past few days, there had been more and more abominations around, all moving in the same direction. Weaving between them was growing harder. Somewhat bored, he shifted in the saddle and asked, "Hey, do you think the government considers us dead?" Jet, who was sitting in front of him, turned her head and gave him an amused look. Sunny sighed. No pun intended. He knew that his friends had to be aware that he was fine. Nephi's could see his runes, after all, and she would have informed the rest. However, being pronounced dead by the government was a bothersome affair. His merchant license would have been revoked, for example, which would put Aiko and the brilliant Emporium in a tight spot. His home could be auctioned off, too. Jet chuckled. I don't think so. They have ways to know such things, the diviners, for example. We were probably marked as missing in action, if anyone even had time to do the paperwork. Sunny wanted to continue the conversation, but then fell silent, a slight frown appearing on his face. Soul Reaper raised an eyebrow. What is it? He shook his head. SHH, listen. At that moment, the wind carried over the sound of distant thunder. It sounded like a rainstorm was raging somewhere far away, but Sunny had spent too much time with the army not to recognize it. The two of them exchanged a meaningful glance. Jet smiled. Railguns. Indeed, the thunderous sound could only be produced by the massive armaments. Commanding Nightmare to turn, Sunny sent his steed in the direction where the thunder had come from. The black stallion flew across the desolate plain, eventually cresting a tall hill. In front of them was a vast lake. In the dim twilight, its surface seemed restless and gray. The shield of ice covering the lake had long been broken, with many gargantuan carcasses floating in the cold water like dark islands. Smaller nightmare creatures were swarming around them, greedily devouring the flesh of the fallen giants. On the other side of the lake, tall alloy walls rose from the shore, with thousands of armaments unleashing a devastating barrage of tungsten rounds on the encroaching mass of abominations. Sunny could even discern the small shapes of soldiers and awakened on the battlements. A long sigh escaped from his lips. A siege capital. Summoning the sin of solace, Sunny closed his eyes for a moment. Then he sent Nightmare galloping down the hill. The black steed rushed toward the lake, surrounded by a tide of moving shadows. Returning from the dead had turned out to be much more chaotic than Sunny expected, and fighting through the horde of nightmare creatures to reach the siege capital was not the most tumultuous part. He was actually accustomed to things like that. The reactions of the people inside the stronghold were much more intense. At first, the commander of the city defenses seemed polite, but unfriendly. After all, the sudden appearance of two ascended outside the walls during a fierce battle had put a lot of pressure on him. Fields of fire had to be rearranged, a safe corridor created. Perhaps his soldiers would even have to sortie to protect the unexpected guests. However, the latter measure had not been needed. Sunny fought his own way to the wall and then scaled it himself. And when the master in charge learned that the two ascended had come from the Antarctic Center, his demeanor completely changed. Falcon Scott B. But the man stared at them with wide eyes for a moment. Then, something akin to joyous pride ignited in them. Sunny did not really know what the master was feeling so proud about, but at least the unfriendliness immediately disappeared. God's great, this is great. I need to inform the no, wait. Are you guys wounded? Do you need medical attention? Crap, what am I saying? Wait, Antarctic Center. Then you are Soul Reaper Jet. Ascended Jet, ma'am, of course you would make it. The news about the annihilation of the Antarctic Center Field Army must have already spread through the quadrant, so the sudden appearance of two ascended survivors had an explosive effect. The soldiers, who had been depressed and despondent about the fate of their comrades, were all suddenly full of joy and ardor. It was as though their own siblings had returned alive from beyond the grave. Sunny had not experienced being stared at so intently, even when masquerading as mongrel. The two of them were promptly brought to the local government headquarters and showered with attention, especially Jet. From what Sunny could understand, the government saint stationed in East Antarctica was coming to the siege capital to welcome her back personally. Sunny was soon going to meet the saint, too. After a short debriefing, during which the government agents could not stop staring at him, he could finally exhale and relax a little. That was strangely exhausting. Sunny spoke to Jet, agreeing to meet the next morning, and then spent a little time in the living quarters assigned to him. He enjoyed a warm shower, a scrumptious meal, and some peace and quiet. Peace and quiet. It felt so strange to not have to fight for his life and the lives of millions of other people without a reprieve. He wondered how long that peace would last. Eventually, Sunny placed a tether inside his room and quietly slipped out of the waking world. He went to visit the ivory tower. On a beautiful island of ancient trees and emerald grass, a lone figure suddenly appeared out of thin air. It was a young man with alabaster skin, wearing a simple tunic of fine black silk. He remained motionless for a few moments, then walked to the edge of the island and froze there, looking down. If not for the wind playing with the young man's black hair, he would have looked like an exquisite statue. The ivory island had changed a bit in the past few months. The great pagoda itself was the same, of course, but the comely wooden buildings created by the fire keepers now resembled a small, peaceful village that blended harmoniously into the landscape. The ancient trees of the grove now had fruit hanging from their branches, each looking ripe and delicious. The white bones of the ancient dragon were still bathed in sunlight, and a graceful ship was still swaying on the placid surface of the clear lake. There was one big change that startled Sunny a lot, though, pulling him out of his reverie. What the hell? Looking down, he did not see the familiar abyssal darkness of the sky below. Instead, he saw a mosaic of flying islands, all connected by colossal chains, slowly floating by. The ivory island was moving. Although the movement was very slow, it had already left the empty expanse of the tier behind, and was now drifting through the clouds toward the southern border of the chained isles. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Since when can this thing move? He lingered for a while, studying the landscape below, then walked along the edge of the ivory island. It seemed that many things had changed while he was in Antarctica. Soon, Sunny reached the waters of the clear lake, which glinted and shone with the reflected sunlight. There was a stone bench near the shore, and a familiar figure sitting on it with a fishing rod in her hand. Tall, attractive, brimming with vitality, Effie was relaxing in the sun and watching the lake. Sunny walked closer and remained silent for a while. Eventually, he said, "There's actually fish in that lake." Effie shrugged lazily. "Who knows? That's what I'm trying to find out. Hopefully. I developed a taste for fish and sea monsters after being stuck on a ship for an entire month." Then she suddenly froze and slowly turned around. Effie's hazel eyes shone with glee. "Sunny, it's you." He smirked. "Who else would it? Arg, gods, put me down, you savage idiot." The huntress had instantly swept him into a crushing hug, and considering their difference in height, Sunny felt his feet leaving the ground. His voice was full of righteous indignation. "I said, gods, don't you have any modesty? Let go of me." Effie exploded with laughter and put him down, and it was a good thing, too. Sunny was this close to using the feather of truth to turn himself as heavy as a huge chunk of marble. He only hesitated because that might have had no effect on her. "When did you arrive?" "No, wait, where the hell are you?" "Neff told us that you are alive, but the news from the Antarctic Center, doofus, are you really all right? What happened?" Sunny gave her a resigned look, then shook his head. "Just now, East Antarctica, I guess. As for what happened, He sighed. Let me think for a moment. I went through 6,000 kilometers of abomination-infested mountains, received a couple of medals, traversed an endless tunnel full of elemental darkness, got killed by a titan, killed that titan back, led a convoy of tens of thousands of refugees to safety, rode a saint into the depths of the ocean to fight a corrupted terror, killed that terror, got blown up, then killed some more nightmare creatures, then lost to a different titan, crossed the strait on a raft, rode a horse all the way to the nearest siege capital. That pretty much covers it, I guess. Oh, I also learned how to play the flute, a little. Sonny paused, then looked at Effie nonchalantly. And what's new with you? She stared at him for a moment, then grinned, wrapped her arm around his shoulder and pulled him toward the tower. I see, so the usual. Don't think that you're getting out of really telling us what happened, though. We've been worried sick, you know. Kai almost had a heart attack right before we disembarked in East Antarctica, when the news of what happened in Falcon Scott reached us. Even Princess seemed a bit shaken. I swear to the dead gods, I almost saw her having a facial expression. Come, let's find the rest of the guys. Sonny estimated his chances of struggling free of Effie's hold as moderate, but then just relaxed and allowed himself to be led toward the ivory tower. That was why he had come here, after all, to speak with the other members of the cohort. He needed to share a lot of practical knowledge with Kai and Effie, as well as speak with Nephi's and Cassie about the great clans. But more than that, he simply wanted to see them. There was a lot of darkness and confusion in his heart, but his friends, his cohort, despite all the complicated matters between them, they were like a small island of stability in the chaotic, unpredictable, deadly world they were all living in. He had missed them all, even though perhaps he shouldn't have. The 4 months Sonny had spent in Antarctica changed a lot of things, making some seem unimportant and some more significant than they used to be. He shook his head. Fine, I'm coming. Can you let me go now? Sonny sighed. At least she did not joke about the graceless dusk. At that moment, Effie gave him a mischievous look. Doofus, I couldn't help but notice. What a nice dress you have. He gritted his teeth. Tunic? It's a tunic. A transcendent armor-type memory which is not a dress but a tunic. Are you blind or what? The great hall of the ivory tower made Sonny shiver, just like the last time he had seen it. It was bathed in bright sunlight that poured through tall and narrow windows. A circle of chains lay in the middle of the hall. That was the gateway. There was no one here, but Effie pulled Sonny to a staircase that led to the underground level of the tower. Its roots were deep, seemingly reaching into the very heart of the island. That stairwell spiraled along the outer wall of the pagoda, and there was a tapestry of beautiful carvings on the ivory stone. The carvings told the stories of the golden age of the Kingdom of Hope, long before it had been destroyed by the Lord of Light. Wait, I don't think there was a way down before. Was it hidden? Confused, Sonny silently followed Effie. Eventually, the two of them reached a vast circular chamber at the bottom of the stairwell. Sonny had never been here before, but expected it to be similar to the lowest level of the Ebony Tower, and indeed it was. However, it was also entirely different. The duplicate tower created by Nether was full of darkness, and there was a ghastly mountain of discarded mannequins occupying the center of its underground level. This chamber, however, was suffused with light. There was a vast and inconceivably complicated runic circle carved into the floor of the chamber, and within it. Sonny stared, not even noticing the two people studying the circle. His body shivered slightly. Is that? Floating in the air at the center of the chamber was a rough, radiant crystal. It was larger than Sonny and gave him a feeling of sublime, awesome, indescribable power. The crystal was like a miniature sun, flooding the underground hall with soft light. Reality itself seemed to ripple and shine around it. It was like nothing Sonny had ever seen. A familiar voice answered, pulling him out of his astonishment. Yes, from what we can tell, this is a divine soul shard. He slowly turned his head and looked at Cassie, who was sitting in front of the runic circle, surrounded by notebooks, etchings, and writing implements. She was wearing simple jeans and a white t-shirt, her pale gold hair gathered in a messy knot bun. Sonny lingered for a moment, not knowing what to say. A divine. At that moment, however, a different voice interrupted him. Sonny. He looked up, only now noticing Kai, who was hovering high above the runic circle. Near the tall ceiling of the chamber, the archer was already descending, and with considerable speed at that. Oh no! Before Sonny could react, he was subjected to another hug. God, Sonny, you had us all worried. He gently struggled out of Kai's embrace, and met his friend's blinding smile with a pale one of his own. Ah, sorry. I guess I'm just a worrisome person. I only died once in the past couple of months, though, so you needn't have worried. Then Sonny looked past the startled archer, stared at the radiant crystal, and took a deep breath. Anyone want to explain to me what is going on? Cassie stood up, sighed, and massaged her knees. Then she gave him a soft smile. I am glad that you're back too, Sonny. With that, she took a few steps back and gestured to the floor of the circular chamber. Take a look at that. He looked down, only now paying attention to the runic circle carved into the white stone. The weave of runes was vast, complicated, and possessed a disturbing familiarity. Sonny frowned. What is that sickening feeling? Then he mentally scaled the runes to many times their size and tilted his head a little. The runes were very similar in style and shape to those of the Red Colosseum. Just looking at them reminded him of the harrowing months he had spent in the cage below the arena. Hope sorcery. Cassie nodded. Indeed, we continued to explore the tower after you left and eventually unlocked the path to this chamber. Our reaction was more or less the same as yours. She shook her head. The Ivory Island holds more secrets than we thought. Well, Nephi's will probably be able to explain it better. In any case, we quickly realized that these runes resembled the ones you had encountered in the ancient theater, so the Fire Keepers went on an expedition to the western edges of the Chained Isles. The Red Colosseum has long turned into a ruin and was teeming with all kinds of dreadful nightmare creatures. It took some effort to eradicate them and clear the floor of the arena. A ruin, good. Kai nodded. Effie and I couldn't participate because we were tied up settling into our roles in the Second Army. However, since Cassie returned, I've been helping her study the runic circle from time to time. A high vantage point helps see it in its entirety, and so on. We've made a little progress, even. Mostly because Cassie had spent a lot of time with Noctis and learned many things, especially about that flying ship of his. She nodded. Yes, in fact, I suspect that the enchantments of the ship were derived from some of Desire's creations. There are many similarities, so, after months of study and comparisons, we managed to decipher a tiny portion of the circle. It is not much, but it did allow us to access one of the island's hidden functions. Sonny just stared at her silently for a few moments. Then he said, Is that why the island is moving? Cassie nodded with a small smile. Indeed, we are now able to move the Ivory Island, albeit very slowly. He hesitated for a bit, then shook his head. Am I the only one who is freaked out by a divine damned soul shard? It's divine. Where did Hope get a divine soul shard? Effie glanced at the radiant crystal and shrugged. There were only 6 gods, but there were plenty of creatures of the divine rank, the former mistress of this tower included. Sometimes they fought side by side, sometimes they fought against each other. Well, of course they did. Considering how terrifying this demon of desire was, is it so surprising that she had a divine soul shard or two? In fact, I am kind of disappointed that we didn't find way more incredible treasures in her basement. Makes sense, though, The damned dragon must have cleaned it all out ages ago. She glanced up, in the direction where the bones of Severax were wrapped around the great pagoda. Kai's face darkened a little. He sighed. Why are we talking about this stuff anyway? Sonny is finally back. He has to be sick of military rations. Let's go, guys. I bet dinner is almost ready. Sonny gave him a long look. Mind if I stay and drool at that shard a bit longer? I mean, it's a divine soul shard. Can you imagine how much that thing costs? Kai shook his head and said, his voice full of resoluteness. No, you can't. I am going to feed you and don't even think about resisting. Sonny looked at the radiant crystal one last time inside. Well, all right, I guess I can go for a bite. As they went back up the stairs, Sonny couldn't help but think about what he had seen in the stone chamber at the root of the great pagoda. The circle of runes, the sublime crystal hovering in the middle of it, that had to be the core of Hope's tower as well as of the whole island. The very heart of the citadel. But what was its purpose? An easy conclusion would be that the divine soul shard was the energy source that powered the enchantments keeping the Ivory Island afloat. But that did not make any sense. The runes had been carved by the demon of desire herself, which meant that the enchantments had been created before her kingdom was destroyed. Back then it had been simply a prospering land. There had been no islands, let alone flying ones. Come to think of it, Sonny was not entirely clear on how the Kingdom of Hope had become the Chained Isles. Had she suspended the remnants of her shattered kingdom above the devouring flames herself, in order to preserve at least some of it, or had it been arranged by Sun God? There were other questions, too. If the divine soul shard was the heart of the citadel, was it powering the gateway? But the gateway was only created recently, after the Seed of Nightmare had been conquered. The spell made it appear, not hope. Had the spell created entirely new enchantments or built upon the existing ones? Cassie had said that there were other functions of the citadel she had yet to master. What were they, exactly? Now that Sonny started thinking about it, he realized that he didn't really know much about citadels. That word just used to describe a human stronghold built around a gateway in the dream realm. He had visited, too, the sanctuary of Noctis and the Ivory Tower. No, actually, 3. The Crimson Spire would have become a citadel, too, if it had not been destroyed. Was there perhaps more to the citadels than he had known? Did all of them have hidden functions? Sonny glanced at Cassie, who was tracing the stone wall with her fingers as she ascended the stairs. I actually learned a bit about Hope's runic sorcery back in the nightmare. If you want, we can compare notes later. Cassie turned her head and smiled with some excitement. Really, that would be very helpful. Sonny sighed. Of course, it would be. Neither of them had any hope of truly learning runic sorcery or Hope's magic, as Noctis had called it, in their lifetime. However, learning how to decipher and use already existing enchantments was not out of the question. After all, a person could swing a sword without knowing how to forge it. Runic sorcery was different from weaving, but perhaps just as ingenious. In the primordial era of the dream realm, mortals had only known one type of sorcery, the sorcery of names. They were capable of invoking the true names of things to wield great power, but speaking those names aloud was often an impossible task. Hope, however, had invented the concept of writing and gifted it to humans. With the knowledge of writing, humans learned how to transcribe true names and did not need to speak them aloud anymore. More than that, the names could be bound to material objects through writing, thus granting the invocation's permanence, and could also be shaped into songs and phrases. However, it was still all based on the knowledge of true names. Without knowing the meaning of the name, transcribing it would have no effect. And there was no way for either Sonny or Cassie to learn that in less than a few centuries. They were both mortals after all. So all they could do was use runic enchantments left behind by someone far more powerful and knowledgeable. Sonny shook his head slightly. wondering what secrets the ivory tower truly held. They made their way back to the first level, and then went higher. In the past, the firekeepers had made their home on the upper levels of the ivory tower, but now it was empty. The awakened following Nephi's and Cassie had moved to the wooden village outside. The second level, the third level, the fourth, finally, they arrived at the fifth, second-to-last level of the pagoda. It was separated into many halls and chambers, some of which had been recently refurbished to serve various purposes. It all resembled the interior of a beautiful, but rather bare-bones manor. A mouth-watering aroma was coming from a half-open door at the end of one of the corridors. Effie hurried toward it with gleaming eyes. Behind the door was a brightly lit hall that was made into a kitchen. Sunny noticed that someone had put a lot of effort into either building cooking appliances or bringing them here from the waking world. The latter could only be done by a master, of course. Although most advanced technology did not work in the dream realm, similar to how it failed in the vicinity of Nightmare Gates, more primitive devices functioned perfectly well. There were expensive, but much more convenient spelltech solutions, too. So while you couldn't really have something like an electric stove or a refrigerator here, you could have a wood stove or an icebox, as well as analogs that worked on essence. Sunny also noticed several large crates of cooking ingredients, beverages, and snacks, which had obviously been delivered from the waking world by the members of the cohort. He did not pay that much attention, though, because there was someone standing in front of the stove, stirring the source of the delicious aroma, a generous amount of fried rice that was being cooked in a bowl-shaped frying pan. Tall, slender, with beautiful silver hair and wearing white apron. Wait, an apron. Sunny blinked a couple of times. Hearing their steps, Nephi's looked over her shoulder and called out, "It's almost ready." Then she suddenly tensed and slowly turned around. Neff's face remained as calm as ever, but there was a hint of agitation in her striking gray eyes. Sunny." He remained silent for a moment, then looked past her. "Sure, you better turn around, though. Don't burn our dinner." Nephi stared at Sunny for a couple moments, then briefly glanced at her apron and quietly cleared her throat. "Right." She turned around and got back to stirring the rice. A couple seconds later, she added without looking back, "You'll have to wait for a couple more minutes. And welcome back, Sunny. Did you make it out of the Antarctic Center all right?" Sunny wondered how much Changing Star knew about the situation in the southern quadrant as he followed Cassie, Effie, and Kai to sit behind a dining table. Settling on a wooden chair, which was far inferior to his own shadow chair, he sighed. "I wouldn't call it all right. But yes, I made it out. I'm already inside a siege capital in East Antarctica." Neff's shoulder moved slightly. "That's good." Effie grabbed a few cans of something sugary and refreshing, then pushed one toward Sunny. "Kai and I spent a whole month in transit aboard those giant ships. We were in the first batch of the Second Army to arrive, so we've been in East Antarctica for about a week. Gods, I thought the ocean was bad, but Antarctica. I have never seen that many nightmare creatures in my life, not even here in the dream realm. It's like the two worlds switched places." Kai nodded somberly. "Indeed. Even though there are secure evacuation corridors between the inland siege capitals and the harbor strongholds, we had to fight a couple battles just to reach our designated sector. Luckily, there were no casualties. The Second Army was twice the size of the First Army, so it was going to take 2 trips for the naval convoys to bring all of it to the southern quadrant. Both Effie and Kai were in the first wave of reinforcements, which was why they had made landfall around the time Sunny himself reached East Antarctica. Sunny looked at them, wondering. East Antarctica was a large place, and it was not a given that their paths would cross until the end of the operation. He really hoped that they would, though. Effie shook her head. "Enough about us. What happened to you? You look a bit different, Sunny." He did indeed look slightly different because of the marble shell. However, Sonny knew that that was not what Effie meant. He sighed and took a sip from the can she had given him. Well, as you know, I was assigned to the first irregular company. In the first month after our contingent of the army made it to the Antarctic Center, things were more or less fine. The field army split into 7 divisions, with one remaining in the city of Falcon Scott, while 6 others moved south to establish 6 more siege capitals. Sonny paused. I was assigned to the southernmost siege capital, and then went on a mission to retrieve a VIP from a remote research station. That was when everything went from bad to worse. The chain of nightmares had gone into overdrive, and 3 whole titans spawned in the Antarctic Center, including an especially troublesome corrupted one. It took a lot to keep his voice from shaking at the mention of the winter beast. The others looked at him intently, and Sonny sighed. I ended up stuck in that research station for about a month, waiting to be evacuated by a battleship. However, the ship never arrived, and everyone in the settlement was eventually eviscerated by a powerful terror. My people and I were the only ones to survive. We were in a bit of a predicament, though, because by that point, reaching the nearest siege capital was more easily said than done. He leaned back, remembering Low 49 and the start of the calamitous march north. His face darkened. And then we learned that the nearest siege capital had actually already been destroyed. So I had to go to the second nearest one, picking up a few refugees in the process. That was when I got trapped in that weird tunnel. Thanks for helping me out, by the way. He forced out a smile, looking at Nephi's and Cassie. Cassie shook her head. Of course, we were quite surprised. The way you delivered the message, very original to say the least. And very you. Hopefully, the little kernel of insight I gleaned was of some help. Sonny chuckled. It helped. I still don't know what that thing in the tunnel was, but we managed to escape from it for a time. Sadly, the second nearest siege capital also ended up being destroyed, and so I had to lead the train of refugees all the way back to Falcon Scott. That was a hell of a journey, but what happened next was even worse. We held the last siege capital for close to 3 weeks, and in that time, about 90% of civilians were evacuated to East Antarctica. After saying that, he remained silent for a while. Eventually, Sonny grimaced. The remaining 10%, though, all died, as did millions of people in the other destroyed siege capitals. St. Tyrus, you know her, had been holding back that corrupted Titan I mentioned. Once she was defeated, the Titan swept in and killed everyone. The whole field army was wiped out. I am hard to kill, so I survived. Well, and here I am. A somber silence settled in the brightly lit hall. Nephi's and Cassie did not speak, probably not knowing what to say, and neither did Effie and Kai. The latter two were especially grim because they were now in Antarctica too. So many people had died, and what had happened to Sonny could very easily happen to the two of them as well. Eventually, Kai sighed. I'm so sorry, Sonny. You've been through a lot. Sonny closed his eyes for a moment. The heart-wrenching memories of the Antarctic Center clawed at his heart, making him want to surrender to a dark and boundless emotion. With a smile, he shook his head. We've all been through a lot. On the Forgotten Shore and in our second nightmares, we've been through hell after hell. But it did really feel different this time. Maybe because I was responsible for other people, and maybe because it was happening right here on Earth, not in some distant place. With that, Sonny glanced at Effie and Kai, then said, trying to cheer them up. You don't have to worry too much, though. Now that the operation is in its second phase, things will calm down a little. East Antarctica is in a much better spot than the Antarctic Center. There are more soldiers, more awakened, more saints, and much fewer obstacles in the way. Sure, it's going to be a tough campaign, and unexpected variables are bound to emerge, but I feel like the worst part is over. With some luck, we will all manage. He smiled, then secretly threw a glance at Nephi's. She was now a part of one of those unexpected variables. Would Neff have something to say to him? As if feeling his gaze, Changing Star turned around and walked their way, soon placing plates of fragrant rice and vegetables in front of each member of the cohort. Her apron had disappeared at some point in the past few minutes. Sitting down, Nephis pushed the plate with the biggest portion towards Sunny, which caused Effie to stare at her indignantly. Neff coughed. "What? Eat everyone before it gets cold." They turned their attention to the food, and for a while, Sunny felt delightfully at peace. It was so strange. He had gone through so much and had changed so much, but now that he was back with his friends, it was so easy to slide into a familiar role, to smile and laugh as if he was the same old Sunny. It felt natural. Even if a small, hidden corner of his heart remained dark and cold, untouched by the peaceful warmth of their reunion. Still, it wasn't a bad feeling. Allowing himself to relax, Sunny concentrated on the food. It had been a long time since he got to eat something Nephis had cooked. The fried rice with vegetables was, indeed, much better than military rations. It was delicious. The small dinner was very enjoyable for Sunny. In fact, after being under crushing pressure for pretty much the entire past 4 months, this sudden moment of levity made him feel like he was on the verge of melting into a puddle of jelly. It was as though the outer edges of his being had been turned into a harsh, rigid shell by the immense strain of the disastrous war. And now that the shell suddenly disappeared, he could not quite remember how to keep himself together without it. Still, he managed. The 5 of them ate and chatted relaxedly, sharing small details about their lives in recent months. Sunny especially had a lot to say. All of them were experienced combatants, but he now possessed precious knowledge of the intricacies of the type of war Effie and Kai would soon be exposed to. The Southern campaign was different from the usual tribulations Awakened faced in the dream realm. The terrain was different, the climate was different, even the cycle of day and night was different. More importantly, the forces arranged against them were different, as were the forces on their side. In Antarctica, Ascended and Awakened had the support of mundane soldiers and modern technology. Sunny had learned a tremendous amount of lessons about how to bring the two together, in no small part because he had commanded a mixed force of Awakened and Mundanes in conditions so desperate that anything less than perfect cohesion would have meant death. Unlike him, who had been a part of a small and exceedingly elite unit, both Kai and Effie were placed in command of large detachments consisting of rank-and-file soldiers. To them, this practical knowledge was more valuable than gold. Small things like using fire resistance enchantments to increase the tactical flexibility of MWP flamethrowers, efficiently triaging mundane soldiers that had been infected by the spell, managing the ammo consumption of the vehicle turrets in relation to the essence consumption of the Awakened, and 1,000 more, could only be learned through experience, or being taught by someone with such experience. Of course, his friends were bright people and immensely talented warriors. In time, they would have reached the same conclusions, but that time could very well cost many lives. That was why Sunny was in a hurry to share his hard-won expertise. The only problem was that actually going over everything was bound to take way more time than they had. So, at some point, he simply used the blessing of dusk, enchantment of the graceless dusk, to establish a mental connection and share his insights in a more direct fashion. Needless to say, his sudden ability to transmit thoughts telepathically startled his friends greatly. Effie flinched, almost falling from her chair, and looked at him with wide eyes. What the hell, Sunny? You're in my head." Sunny paused, suddenly realizing that he should have probably warned them before establishing the connection. He chuckled awkwardly. "Oh, sorry, I should have explained first. One of the enchantments of my tunic, it's a tunic, you troglodyte, allows me to establish a mental link with other living beings. Don't worry, though, I can't read your thoughts, and in your case, Effie, I wouldn't even want to. Gods, I shudder just imagining what is going on in that depraved head of yours. In any case, you have to willingly transmit a thought for me to receive it. Imagine it as thinking out loud. She hesitated for a few moments, then instantly sent over a mental image that made Sonny spit out his drink and glare at her with murder in his eyes. Effie grinned, then waved a hand. All right, I get it. What a great enchantment. With the help of the blessing of dusk, the conversation flowed much faster. Eventually, though, both Kai and Effie had to leave. They had just arrived at their assigned siege capital, after all, so there was a lot for them to do. In fact, days like this, when all five could freely gather in the dream realm together, were bound to be rare until the Antarctica operation was over. Cassie excused herself, too, returning to the root chamber of the tower to continue studying the runic circle. Sonny and Nephi's were left alone in the sunlit hall. He hesitated. Throughout the dinner, Sonny had avoided speaking about the matters that gnawed on him, the war between the great clans and their plans for Antarctica. In fact, he felt reluctant to start that conversation even now. However, he had already learned the unpleasant lesson of what happened when he postponed important conversations until the last possible moment. Sonny's relaxed expression slowly changed to one of grim sharpness. Looking at Nephi's, he leaned back a little and asked, "You told me before that valor and song would most likely turn the southern quadrant into their private battlefield. How sure are you of it now, after 4 months?" Neph lingered for a while, her beautiful gray eyes clear and calm. Then she said, "I am pretty sure. In fact, it has already been set in stone." Sonny let out a resentful sigh. "Damn them." He gritted his teeth, staring into the distance with a harsh expression. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the hall seemed much darker. "This is insanity." Sonny shook his head, feeling a strong desire to break something. "This is pure madness, Neph. I've been told that the great clans have long given up on the waking world. Standing aside and watching the lives of hundreds of millions of people be destroyed is already unforgivable. But coming to mess things up even further is just beyond all reason. I just don't understand." Changing Star looked at him evenly. Then a strange, joyless smile slowly appeared on her face. "I can help you with that." Sonny frowned. "What exactly do you mean?" Nephi sighed, then looked away. "You've done a lot in the past 4 months, Sonny. Cassie and I might not have gone through as much as you have, but we haven't been idle either. We've managed to discover a few things, although not as many as I would have liked. After all, it has only been a few months. They don't trust me much yet." She paused for a moment. This war between valor and song has always seemed a little strange. And now, I think I know why. A lot of things still remain unclear, but we did solve the most important mystery. Changing Star looked at him and said, "The true reason why the great clans are at war. Do you want me to tell you? That will certainly help you understand." Sonny remained silent for a while, looking at Nephi's with a somber expression. Eventually, a dark smile appeared on his face. "Do tell." Neph sighed, then stood up and started gathering the dirty plates. Her movements were calm and unhurried, as if they had not been discussing matters that could very well decide the fate of the whole world. "Help me do the dishes." Sonny blinked, amused by the mundane banality of her request. He lingered for a moment, then shook his head and went about giving Changing Star a hand. As they cleaned the plates in the cold water produced by either a memory or the ivory tower itself, she started talking. "I've known for a long time that the great clans, especially Song and Valor, were opposed to each other, despite being outwardly unified. The symptoms of the approaching war were quite apparent if one knew where to look. However, the reasons for this animosity have always eluded me. Kai Song and Anvil had been comrades once, after all. Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. My father was their comrade too. Sunny hesitated for a moment. Do they really need a reason, though? Power is already reason enough. Both have an unimaginable amount of it, but in my experience, those who possess great power are the ones most greedy for more. Nephi slowly shook her head. Maybe, but they are not fools. This war of theirs is too ill-timed and too destructive. The great clans stand to lose more from it than they would gain. There are other powers to consider, too, the House of Night, for example. Even the government, or Asterion, wherever he might be. If both song and valor are weakened by the clash, the lesser threats might very well swoop in to finish off the victor. She paused for a bit. So, I suspected there had to be something else at play. And as it turns out, there is, although I only learned of it recently. I still don't know why the hostility between the two great clans has suddenly escalated so much now. Of all the times it could have, now seems like a terrible time to go to war. However, I think I do know the true source of their conflict. Sunny glanced at her, consumed by tense anticipation. It felt as though he was about to learn a great secret, one that would finally let him see the full picture clearly, or at least show him the way to the truth. Very few people in the world could have uncovered this mystery, but Changing Star herself had infiltrated one of the great clans, while Cassie was helping her. And now, he was going to benefit from their effort. Sunny remained silent, waiting. Nephi's calmly wiped the last plate, put it on the drying rack, and turned to him. White sparks ignited in her eyes. It has to do with the sovereigns and their domains. He raised an eyebrow. Domains. I've heard a few people use that word. However, I still don't know what it means. Nephi's nodded, then headed toward the stairs to the sixth, highest level of the tower. Come if you want. Sunny gave her a dark look, then followed. As they ascended the stairs, Neph spoke. To people who know about the existence of the sovereigns, domains are synonymous with their rule. So one might say that they belong to a domain, meaning that they serve one of the supremes. However, there is a deeper secret here. As I found out, domains are not just an abstract concept. In fact, they are very real. A domain is an extension of a sovereign's aspect. Sunny stared at her silently. He had suspected as much, but never had any proof. More than that, he had no idea what that statement actually implied. So it is an ability, like the transformation ability that the saints possess. One that affects an area, perhaps. Neph frowned. Not exactly. Once a transcendent becomes a supreme, they do unlock another ability, one that is tremendously powerful at that. You might call it a supreme, ultimate, or pinnacle ability, I guess. But a domain is something separate from the supreme ability. It is another innate function of the aspect. Just like controlling soul essence or accessing the soul sea, is a natural progression of one's ability to express their power. She lingered for a moment. Within their domain, a sovereign is nearly invincible. Mind you, I don't know everything about it just yet. I've just gleaned bits and pieces of information where I could. The point is, each step of the path of ascension as well as of the path of corruption has its own meaning. The first path is the ascent toward divinity, while the second is the descent into profanity. They reached the sixth level, which, just like the first, only encompassed one spacious hall. This one was smaller than the great chamber where Hope had once been chained, and suffused with bright sunlight. It was empty and Spartan, with only a few pieces of wooden furniture and a bed occupying a small section of the vast stone floor, the white curtains of the bed's canopy billowing in the wind. Apparently, this was where Nephi's herself lived. She led Sunny to one of the 4 large balconies and stopped there, looking at the breathtaking vista of the boundless blue sky. The clouds were rolling past the ivory island like a swirling, radiant sea. Those who are dormant can awaken. After that, some rise above the mundane and take the first step toward the divine, becoming ascended. Others descend into the abyss of corruption and become fallen, That is the meaning of the second step, rise or fall. The essence of the third step is transformation. Ascended truly transcend their mundane origin, becoming transcendent. Fallen become corrupted by the dark abyss, and are thus called corrupted. Sunny looked at her and frowned. Awakening, ascension, transformation. What about the fourth step, then? What about the great and the supreme? Nephi's met his gaze, her cold gray eyes shining with the reflected sunlight. The essence of the fourth step is authority. I guess a god has to be a god of something or someone. At the fourth step, the sovereigns start to coalesce their domains, and that, I think, is much more important than all other forms of power they possess. I think only the domain can pave the way for a supreme to take the next step on the path of ascension and become sacred. Sunny looked down at the rolling sea of clouds. He was considering Nef's words. Some of what she said was common knowledge. People had long theorized that there was a profound meaning to the way the spell named different ranks. Ascended were called ascended because they had risen above their human nature. Transcendent were called transcendent because they had broken past it, assuming some traits of the divine. The Supremes, then, took another step toward godhood, and that step seemed to be tied to authority. It made sense, really, because that progression was similar to how nightmare creatures grew in class. The tyrants were all about rule and authority, too. However, there was something in what Nephi's had told him that caught Sunny's attention. He glanced at her and asked, "Did you say start to coalesce their domains?" That word meant much more than one would think. If there was a start, there also had to be an end. Much more importantly, it hinted that a domain was not something that Supremes simply gained. There was a process to it. Neph smiled. "Indeed, you caught on to the very heart of the issue. The domains are not set in stone as all other forms of power. They can change and be changed. Simply put, a domain can grow. In fact, I suspect that it must grow for a Supreme to realize his or her potential. And therefore, a domain can also be diminished." Sunny's eyes gleamed. He was starting to understand. I see now, of course. It makes so much sense." He looked at her intently, the shadows around him growing darker. "And how exactly do domains grow?" Changing Star lingered for a moment, then turned to look at the sky. "Well, it is hard to say. All domains are unique after all, just like all aspects are unique. However, there are some common things that all of them most likely share. So, I would say that there are two ways. One is the natural way. That was how the ancient people of the dream realm spread their authority and built their domains." Sunny slowly nodded. People like Noctis and Oro of the Nine had also been awakened. However, he knew very little about how they reached higher ranks of power. There had been no nightmares in the ancient past, nor had there been the spell. The spell. Nephi's noticed the look of realization on his face and nodded. "Yes, the spell provides training wheels for the awaken of the lower ranks, creating a harrowing but swift and streamlined road for them to reach greater power. There are so many tools it gives us that we take for granted, so why wouldn't it provide assistance to the sovereigns as well? The spell has created a straightforward way for the Supremes to expand their domains." She took a step back and placed her hand on the ivory wall of the great pagoda. "Do you get it yet?" Sunny stared, silent. A few moments later, he said in a low voice, "The citadels." Neph smiled. "Correct. No matter what authority you wield, it can only spread through two mediums, I think. Territory or people. The citadels naturally encompass both. We knew all along that the spell creates the gateways, which serve as the heart and purpose for the existence of the citadels. However, as it turns out, there is more to it." "Much more." She lingered for a few moments, then frowned. "I am not too sure about the true scope of what functions the citadels hide. What I do know, however, is that saints already have the ability to bind them. We have not found out what this binding entails exactly, but I think it is safe to say that if a saint serves a sovereign and takes control of a citadel, the sovereign's domain expands. Changing Star hesitated. It also seems that not all citadels are created equal. There are some that are very special and much more desirable, like Bastion or Ravenheart, or this island. It is not a coincidence that each of the great clans had fought to conquer one of the locations marked on the map you found in the Ebony Tower. Sunny looked at her sharply, considering the implications. Bastion, Ravenheart, the Ivory Tower, from what he knew, each of these places had served as the stronghold of one of the demons. The House of Night was in possession of the fourth one. The fifth was located in the utterly lethal Hollow Mountains, which Clan Valor had nevertheless put a lot of effort into exploring, disregarding the danger. And the sixth one, the last one, considering that Weaver did not seem to have possessed a stronghold, the sixth one, was the Black Pyramid far to the east, the pyramid that seemed to be somehow tied to the chain of nightmares. Sunny took a deep breath. So, what exactly are you trying to say? Nephi shook her head. Isn't it obvious? Both Anvil of Valor and Kai Song need to expand their spheres of influence to perfect their domains. However, there are only so many human citadels to go around, which means that two domains, or at least these particular two domains, can't coexist. For one to be perfected, it has to swallow the other. She grew quiet for a moment, and then said somberly, "That is the true reason for the war between their clans." Sunny looked away, an ugly grimace contorting his face. A sense of dark, vicious anger was smoldering in his heart. Neff sighed. Antarctica will be the first major battlefield of this war, but it won't be the last. Most of it will happen in the Dream Realm after both sides deliver their strikes. But the first act is also the most important. If one of the clans manages to gain momentum in the southern quadrant, their advantage might very well snowball into an unstoppable avalanche. So their clash in Antarctica will be extremely fierce and bloody. In fact, Anvil is sending his own daughter there. Morgan will lead Valor forces in the southern quadrant. That alone shows how serious his intentions are. Changing Star studied the clear skies, then turned to Sunny and said, her voice even, "So, now, do you understand?" Sunny remained silent for a while, responding only when the pressure of the flaw started to turn into searing pain. "Yeah, I think I understand." Many things became clearer now. Finally, he knew more about the sovereigns and the power they wielded. Awakened, masters, and saints, all of them were bestowed with great strength, but that strength was of a personal kind. Supremes were, without doubt, even more fearsome warriors. However, their true advantage lay in their authority. He was not too certain about what exactly a domain did. Even Nephi's did not know the details, after all, but understood the concept. A domain was a physical manifestation of a sovereign's aspect, a territory where their rule was supreme. And that manifestation, while representing their personal strength, relied on external factors to exist and grow. Authority, influence, power over someone and not just yourself. All of these things were conveniently intertwined in the form of citadels, which the spell created. Citadels. Sunny looked down as if trying to pierce the ivory tower with his gaze. Then he sighed. There were still a lot of unanswered questions. On the surface, the intention of the sovereign seemed obvious. Well, with the exception of Asterion, who was the most mysterious of the three. They had established their nascent domains in the unique citadels that had once belonged to the demons, and then slowly expanded their rule, uplifting loyal ascended to sainthood, and eliminating those transcendent who refused to swear fealty to them, thus failing to become the vessels of their domains. The only two exceptions were the House of Night, and to a much lesser extent, the government. Both were convenient to have around and fulfilled a necessary function. The seat of power of the great clan Night, on top of that, was located in the deadly waters of the Storm Sea. Launching an invasion into their territory was a dire task. But what about Professor Obel's theory? Indeed, something did not add up. If Anvil of Valor and Kai Song were so obsessed with perfecting their domains, then why were they suppressing the emergence of saints? The more transcendence there were, the more human citadels there would be in the dream realm, and the more territory they would be able to conquer. Come to think of it, if they really had no choice but to wage war on each other, then why had they waited for 2 decades to start it? Why were they only attempting the conquest now? Why had they waited for the chain of nightmares to descend upon the southern quadrant? Sunny frowned, then glanced at Nephi's. I feel like we are still missing a key piece of information. This timing, it is just too strange. And hateful. Of course, there was a possibility that all of it was just a coincidence. Maybe Kai Song simply decided to use the power imbalance that the death of Saint Cormac and Mordred's ascension had created. But Sunny felt like there was more to this war than they thought. Neff leaned on the parapet of the sunlit balcony and sighed. We certainly do. The sovereigns have many secrets and I won't claim to know all of them. But does it really matter what they are hiding? The truth remains the same. Sunny scoffed. She was right. Nephi's was determined to destroy the sovereigns because they were suppressing humanity in its conquest of the spell and, more importantly, stood in her way. She did not care what motivated the Supremes, and neither did Sunny. He hated them all the same. Valor and Song deserved each other as far as he was concerned. But Antarctica was about to be swept up in their treasonous strife, and that he could not allow to happen. Look at you go. Do you even hear yourself? Who are you to defy the great clans? Do you imagine yourself to be someone capable of stopping them? You're definitely not. Sure, you have some power, but in the grand scheme of things, you're just a bug. A single master, no matter how strong, is only capable enough to be an expendable pawn. Sunny gritted his teeth. It was true. No matter how incensed he was, there was nothing he could do. The best Sunny could hope to achieve was to minimize the damage that the clash of the great clans was bound to do to the evacuation effort. A little. That only made him angrier. Well, then that's exactly what I am going to do. I will prepare, learn their weaknesses, and try to suppress the fallout of their despicable acts as much as I can. Luckily, Sunny knew just the right person to provide him with information. Knowing what the opponent was planning came first. He remained silent for a few moments, then glanced at Neff. So what exactly is going to happen? What will be their first move? She smiled wistfully. In a few months, the great clans will announce that they are sending reinforcements to the southern quadrant. Both Song and Valor will dispatch a strong force to Antarctica, but not too strong. A couple more saints, a dozen or two masters, and a few hundred awakened. Officially, their mission will be to support the evacuation army in fighting the nightmare creatures. In reality, however, they are being sent there to fight each other. Sunny scowled, slightly confused. How though? By now, most of the human forces on the continent are concentrated in the siege capitals, with very little reason to venture outside. Are these saints and their forces going to just go and attack the cities? Nephi shook her head. No, at least I think they won't. Not unless there is a very good reason to. In truth, they won't be staying behind the walls of the siege capitals most of the time, because they have a secondary goal as well, one that requires going outside and attacking the nightmare creatures. He tilted his head a little. And what goal might that be? Changing Star simply looked at him, and a moment later, Sunny's eyes widened slightly. The pyramid. Nephi's nodded. Song and Valor are going to be in a race to conquer it. They will search for nightmare gates that can be used to establish a beachhead in the unexplored region of the Dream Realm where the Black Pyramid is located. Once they find a comparatively safe ford, they will use the call to transport their saints, masters, and awaken there, establishing temporary outposts. She paused, looked at him, and continued. These outposts will be used to launch expeditions toward the pyramid. The end goal is to find a relatively safe place in close proximity to it, build a true fortress there, and then use that fortress as the staging ground for the conquest of the tomb. Changing Star lingered for a moment. It might be easier to think of it in terms of the Forgotten Shore. Each gate is connected to a seed of nightmare somewhere in the region. Some seeds might be in the depths of the Crimson Labyrinth, and everyone who follows the call to the area around them will be drowned by the Dark Sea. Some seeds, however, might be located on higher ground. Those who enter the dream realm near these seeds will be able to survive, and then slowly make their way through the labyrinth. The end goal is to find a place like the Dark City, build a fortress akin to the Bright Castle, and then use it to conquer the Crimson Spire. What an apt metaphor! Sunny couldn't help but smile darkly. They might find out that this task is much harder than they imagine it to be. In theory, such a plan seemed solid. Each of the hundreds, if not thousands of nightmare gates in East Antarctica was connected to a seed of nightmare in the region surrounding the tomb of Ariel. By relying on the call, these gates could be used to enter the dream realm somewhere near the corresponding seed. Then, by pinpointing a suitably safe area and the gate connected to it, the great clans could transport their forces into the dream realm without risking instant annihilation. These forces would then explore and fight their way toward the Black Pyramid. The region could contain several citadels. Even by conquering one, Song or Valor would be able to establish a safe and stable corridor to ferry fighters and supplies over. If there were no citadels except for the tomb of Ariel itself, though, the saints would have to play the role of ferrymen. But the mysterious desert was utterly lethal. It was much worse than even the Forgotten Shore, and the forces of the great clans would not only have to fight against the endless flood of nightmare creatures populating it, they would also have to fight against each other. Sunny couldn't help but shiver. Nephi's meanwhile simply nodded. The task will be a hellish one indeed, but these are the great clans, Sunny. No matter how you and I might feel about them, their fearsome reputation is not unearned. Both Valor and Song represent the absolute pinnacle of human achievement in warfare. If they can't do it, no one can. He remained silent for a while, thinking. The real goal of the great clans was to kill each other, while their secondary goal was to conquer the tomb of Ariel. One naturally led to the other. He now knew that the siege capitals would remain mostly unmolested by their war, at least, unless something unexpected happened. However, both clans would be feverishly seeking suitable gates in East Antarctica, without doubt ambushing and slaughtering each other in the process. Army patrols and the infrastructure of the evacuation corridors could very well become collateral damage in their clashes. Not to mention that they were bound to send the nightmare creatures into a frenzy, and maybe even lead the abominations back to the cities. There would be some violence within the siege capitals as well, or at least bloody clandestine operations. Two of the three saints currently present in East Antarctica belong to the warring factions. After all, if the servants of Kai Song had an opportunity to deal with Saint Tyrus in Falcon Scott, they would have taken it, without a doubt. The consequences for the civilians sheltered in the city be damned. Bastards! In any case, Sunny had some idea about how things would progress in the coming months now. This was already enough for him to start thinking. Eventually, he glanced at Nephi's and hesitated for a few moments. There was one question that was still gnawing at his hem. Sunny sighed. And where will you be while all of this is happening? Nephi's looked at him. White sparks danced in her eyes, and then she suddenly smiled. Where do you think? Of course, I will be accompanying Morgan, sister dearest, to Antarctica. Cassie, the fire keepers, and I, all of us are going there with her. I've told you that Valor does not trust me much yet. What better way to earn trust and merit than on the battlefield? He stared at her silently for a while. I guess there is none, so we are going to meet in the southern quadrant. Changing Star shrugged. If you wish, or you can stay out of this mess entirely. You have made it very clear that you don't want to have anything to do with the great clans and their war, so it's up to you if and how much you get involved. Sunny smiled darkly. Up to me, huh? Yeah, no, that ship has sailed. He really could hide in some remote siege capital, use his service record and exalted status to get himself a cushy assignment, and spend the rest of the campaign relaxing, as much anyone could relax in Antarctica. However, was he willing to? Did he want to? Not really. If I do not go to hell, who else will go? Sunny had once told the Sin of Solace that the great clans were free to act with impunity, because there was no one around to hold them responsible. He did not wish to teach anyone lessons in responsibility. But he did want to teach those bastards a lesson in humility. The harsher and more painful the lesson, the better. I'll make them pay. If I go to hell, I'll drag them with me. Sunny looked at the boundless blue sky, then turned to Nephi's and smiled. See you in Antarctica, then. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.